Media loves to tell young Australian adults that they're priced out of the property market, that the goal of achieving a first home is a hopeless dream. It simply isn't so. They use a lot of erroneous information to arrive at an equation that says it takes 5 to 6 years or 7 or 8 years in the more expensive cities to save a deposit to buy a typical home, and the situation is generally hopeless. The reality is a lot different. Why do they do it? Well, because their objective isn't to be helpful. Their objective is to create negative sensation, to create headlines, to publicise themselves. So the typical article that you will see in mainstream media will say something like this: it takes 8 years for a young couple on typical incomes to save a 20% deposit to buy the medium-priced home in Sydney or Melbourne. And that equation is full of erroneous bullshit information, which is quite deliberately designed to arrive at a negatively sensational outcome, which says it's hopeless. It's not realistic. Here's what is realistic. Firstly, why are we talking about houses? The research shows that most young adults prefer the apartment lifestyle, not just because it's cheaper, because it suits their lifestyle aspirations better. So these equations never talk about apartments, which happen to be cheaper, because it doesn't achieve the objective of a negative outcome. So what we should be talking about firstly is how long does it take to save a reasonable deposit to buy an apartment? Medium prices. Why are they talking about medium prices? Young first-time buyers don't buy medium-priced property. They buy in the lower price ranges. Suggesting that they should be able to buy the medium-priced property in markets like Sydney and Melbourne is like suggesting that a young person who finishes school, gets a job, saving to buy their first car, and they're outraged because they can't afford to buy an $80,000 or $90,000 vehicle. They want to buy an Audi, if not a Rolls Royce, and they can't afford it. Well, it's unrealistic, and that's not what happens. Realistically, what happens is a second-hand car that's affordable to give them reasonable mobility at an affordable price, and it's similar in the housing market. People starting out buy in the lower price ranges, but these equations published in media never talk about the lower price quartiles. They talk about medium prices, and they talk about houses, not apartments. So you start to arrive at a more realistic equation when you start to put in some reasonable parameters, apartments rather than houses, because that's what a lot of young people prefer, priced in the lower price ranges, not medium price property, because that's where first home buyers are going to be targeting, and not a 20% deposit. Why 20%? Nobody saves a 20% deposit anymore. You don't need to. You can get into your first home with a much smaller deposit than that, and with the new federal government scheme that started on the 1st of January, 5% is enough to get a loan to get your first home, and you don't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance because of that scheme. So suddenly the equation becomes a lot more attainable and a lot more realistic when you think in terms of a 5% deposit, apartments, lower price ranges. And the reality is that in 5 of our capital cities, the median apartment price is below $395,000, which means that half of all sales are much lower than $395,000. Canberra's, the median price for apartments is about $440,000. Again, that means that half of all sales are less than that. So in summary, it means that in 6 of our capital cities, you can find reasonable apartments and reasonable locations somewhere in the 300,000s. Now, if you're saving a 5% deposit to buy at 300,000, at the bottom of that sort of price quartile perhaps, you need a deposit of just $15,000. Now, a young couple, both working, if they can't get together a $15,000 deposit, they're not trying hard enough. A member of my family who's 19, going to university in Melbourne full-time with a part-time job, last year saved $12,000. So a young couple, both working, should be able to get a $15,000 deposit together. To buy a reasonable apartment in Melbourne, it's probably going to be more, so perhaps $20,000, $25,000, but that starts to become attainable when you start to talk about realistic objectives, apartments, lower price ranges, 5% deposit. Suddenly you're not talking about taking 5 or 6 or 8 years to save a deposit to get a first home. You're talking about a situation where in maybe 1 to 2 years that can be achieved and with the help of family, maybe a lot faster. So yeah, apartments in most of our capital cities, not so much in Sydney, but certainly in 6 of the 8 capital cities, very attainable. In Melbourne, also in certain locations, also attainable, and good locations as well, such as the middle ring northern suburbs of Melbourne, suburbs like Brunswick, Coburg, Northcote, good apartments, attainable at reasonable prices and attainable for first-home buyers. And then with houses, in some of our capital cities, you can still buy houses, certainly in the 300,000s and in some sectors of the market, in some cities in the 200,000s. Earlier in the week, in my hotspot of the week, I highlighted 3 precincts in capital city Australia where you can readily buy houses in the 200,000s. One of those was in Adelaide, one was in Brisbane, and the other was in Perth. And then, of course, there's regional Australia, and increasingly we're seeing, for example, young home buyers out of Melbourne going out to regional Australia to cheaper locations like Geelong, Ballarat, still within striking distance of the capital city of Victoria, but property is a lot more attainable, different lifestyle, well connected transport wise, and that's an option also available. In regional Victoria, the median house price is $395,000 compared to $780,000 in Melbourne. So there are lots of options available for first-timers wanting to get into the market either as rent investors or as first-home buyers. And it's not the dire situation that's been portrayed regularly in media, which says that it takes you 5, 6, 7, 8 years to save a deposit to buy a medium-priced house. Unrealistic, not helpful, but then their objective is not to be helpful. It's to create sensation and negative headlines. So I hope that the information that I presented is a little bit more helpful, because that's what it sets out to be. Apartments in most of our capital cities certainly attainable reasonably quickly by first-home buyers, and in some cases in some of our cities, Adelaide, Perth, Darwin, Brisbane, Hobart, houses also attainable at reasonable prices. It's a different story, of course, in Sydney, our most expensive city. That's a whole other chapter of the war on misinformation. But that's it for now. Let's do it again, same time next week.